Dustin Wells, welcome to Paper Napkin Wisdom. I'm really happy to have you here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So, you shared with me an interesting napkin, and I think it means a lot of different things, and I'm excited to dive into it. It says, Summit your current mountain. Why did you share that with me?
Um, well, I think there's a long story there, and I'll tell a short version of it. But I have been in tech for over 20 years, and I had the opportunity to exit and sell my company. And I almost didn't take the opportunity to do that. I had no plans to sell. But one of my board members convinced me to go ahead and pull the trigger on it. And I'm really glad I did. The reason I wasn't going to sell is because I was ecstatic every day to get up and do what I was doing. I was fully engaged. I loved the people that I worked with. I loved the company that we created together. And that was a really fulfilling journey every day. And so I thought, why would I trade this for something else? And um, after the exit and after the earnout, I started to see other opportunities that I would have never seen had I not summited that first mountain. And I see people a lot of times continuing to work towards something that it maybe there's an annual goal behind it, but it's this aspirational thing. And at some point, that work is done. And it's time to summit that mountain and then see what's on the other side. And so that's where that napkin came from all the opportunities that I've seen kind of post exit in an exit that I'd never planned to have.
That's one of the things that's really surprising to hear you talk about is this idea of never planning to have the exit, right? Like, I think, especially in tech, the dogma, the reinforced story is you build to sell. You're always building for an exit, but you didn't build that way, or you didn't at least believe that 20 years in, which is kind of remarkable. Like, how did that come about?
Yeah, for me, it was building a company that I wanted to work at every day and that I wanted to go to. And if I did that, I would probably find other people that also wanted to be there. I wanted to build a company to last, and it created a great lifestyle. It created a great impact on the clients we worked with and on the employees that we had and that we worked with. And it also created an impact in the entrepreneurial community, where I'm so proud to see companies that spun out, where people left my company to start other companies that are similar and did it with full support, and other companies that have modeled after some of the things that we did, and we modeled after other companies. So there's ways to kind of pay it forward. And so I was always focused on building a healthy company that was cash flow positive and profitable, that prioritized people over everything else first, and culture. And that ended up being what our acquirer wanted. And so without building for exit explicitly, we actually built something that was really valuable.
That's really Dustin, it's not normal to hear people talk about building a company where people spun out of your company and built things adjacent to your company with your blessing. Like, that's not normal. People usually, try to limit that and squelch that out. You didn't.
Yeah, I've always had an abundance mindset, and sometimes it's harder than other times to think about it in that way. But I can explicitly think of one group that came out of our company to start a company that's essentially in the same business. And we actually not only set them up with their lawyer and general counsel, but we also gave them their first client, which happened to be a client that we grew out of, and they still have that client today. And they've grown that business to I want to say 10 plus now, or they're on their way, and they're going to see a great exit at some point too in their future. And so that makes me really proud that I was able to play a small part in that journey.
Small part.
They've
I mean, it's a big part.
they've done, I mean, entrepreneurship. I could have been out of business any week taking the first 10 years, except for that one deal closing that helped us make payroll. So it's hard, but we definitely helped give a start to some of these entrepreneurs that were coming out of our company. into their own path, and that feels really fulfilling.
So you teased something in that piece, Dustin, and I think it's really important that you've always had this abundance mindset, even though things were not always easy, right?
Yeah.
And you talked about 20 years in the first half being particularly challenging. It wasn't all sunshine and roses early on, right?
Never. I mean, I learned how to sell through the School of Hard Knocks. I made cold calls. I taught a cold call class to get over my fear of cold calling, where I was this close to booking a meeting, which was kind of the goal of the call, in front of like 30 people, and so I had to learn everything the hard way, and it's not easy. The first 10 years, which seems like, I think there's a 2-year milestone that's really important for businesses where you become more sustainable. If you can make it 2 years, then you're probably going to make it 10. But if you give up before the 2-year mark, then I don't know that you really gave it a fair chance. But
Mhm.
even the next 8 years after that were not easy. Um, and it feels different in today's time with the tech that's available and the ways to accelerate ideas into concept and into monetization. Feels very different now. I started my company in 2001, just for context.
Yeah. So, and you started it sort of in this sort of the same philosophy, summiting your current mountain. You sort of did that. You started in kind of an innovative way. Why don't we share that story?
How I started the business.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the early way I started, I was a musician and have a music degree. And this was back in the late 90s. And the tech was obviously full steam ahead at that point, up to the dot-com crash,
Yeah.
which is like a
Y2K, all
history
that stuff.
lesson. Yeah, and all that kind of stuff, which is hilarious to think about now. But for me, I wasn't that marketable for a job. I wanted to get out of music because I was getting home at like 4 in the morning and had a baby at home, and that just wasn't conducive for family life. And so I read HTML for Dummies, and I built my first website for $500, and that's how I started the company. I was self-taught engineer back then. You had to learn everything through books. There was no online blogs or code online or things like that. And so that's how I got started, was with that book, and then slowly uh, just tried to get better every year and tried to build on that a little bit more every single year. In the first 7 years, call it, you know, we were sub $1 million, and but every year I doubled. So that
Yeah.
means the first year I was 18,000 in revenue, which was pretty meager.
Yeah. Yeah. What I really think is really interesting is how similar the times are, though they're so dynamically different, right? You were self-taught and
Yeah.
you had to experiment with everything because there was no playbook for building a tech company or HTML company back then, right? Like a web design company.
Yeah.
But now it's sort of like the same way, but just in a different vertical of technology. I mean, things that are well understood, but this whole thing around reward-based AI and where we're going in the future, it's books, it's theoretical, and you have to learn
Yeah,
yourself.
that's fair. But yeah, and back to the abundance mindset, like when I started, I had a ton of mentors that were ahead of me on that path. One of which was my board member that convinced me to sell. And 20 years later. And so we're talking about long-term relationships where we're all in a very similar business for consulting, yet they abundantly shared their time and resources and knowledge with me. And so that felt like the right path for me as that opportunity came up for me to be on the other side of that.
That sort of student mindset that attracted those mentors, those people that were ahead of you, right? And I think it's a learning mindset, it's a humility mindset that you
Yeah.
have. Was that something that you always had, or was that something that sort of came about through your experience in business?
I've always had a humility mindset for sure, a mindset for learning and trying to get better and trying to grow. I think most people that know me well will say I'm probably the most growth focused person that they've seen. And every year for the last 20 or more, I've been in some kind of coaching program or development program or some kind of training program. where I'm trying to learn a new skill or trying to hone my craft.
Yeah. So that constant learning is part of summiting your mountain, right? I mean, in order to do that, that's how you got into business. You self-taught, and then you've kept ahead of that by teaching. Is it the teaching
Mhm.
that builds the abundance mindset, or is the abundance mindset that fuels the learning mindset? Like
I
which
think
way?
I yeah, I think you have to start with the abundance mindset personally. I mean, that's been my experience.
Yeah.
And then that has led to people being abundantly kind to me and sharing their gifts with me, and for me to be able to pay that forward as well. Um, and then as we talk about summiting that second mountain, or the first mountain, and then we get to see what the second mountain is. I mean, literally think of the metaphor of hiking. And if you're hiking up a mountain, I live in Colorado right now, and like if you're hiking up a mountain, you have no idea what's on the other side, but you get to the top of one, and it's usually this beautiful vista, but then you see a new thing that you want to go attack, and maybe this new trail that you want to go take. And this feels a lot like that. But what I see entrepreneurs do is they stay and they continue to grind on their business. Like I could have stayed in my business, I could have probably doubled it over the last 3 years, and then I could have maybe doubled it again. But I think understanding the question, like what is enough, is something that comes up a lot in entrepreneurial circles. And
Mhm.
for me, I had that number, and when I hit it, I took it. And that actually opened up all these opportunities that I never would have seen and that I would have never been able to explore had I just kept grinding on it and kept growing it.
So what did you have to do to get that number? I think a lot of people either, I think most people think too big around that number, and
Mm.
that's a trap, right? I mean, it keeps you on the conveyor belt or on the treadmill for too long. But what did you do to get your number in your mind?
Yeah, so I've done the exercise a couple of times and the number's gone up. And so it is important, I think, at some point to draw a line and say, this is the number, and here's the rationale for why. But the inspiration for that for me came from watching fellow entrepreneurs and friends sell their companies for not enough. And 2 years later, they either had to start something else or they had to find a job because they didn't sell for enough. So when I talk about enough, what I wanted was the ability to create income from the principal, the after tax principal, the before earnout principal, which we can go into. But I wanted enough from that first check where if I lived out the income at 5%, that created the income number that I needed for the rest of my life. So I could have the flexibility to go do whatever I wanted to do after that without the need to go do it for financial gain or to make a living.
I love that you're talking. I think a lot of us entrepreneurs suspend or delay gratification to something later. But on the exit, what you did was you said before earnout, after tax principal had to yield you a return, not at 10%, not at 20%, but at 5% that
Yeah.
was going to provide the income you needed to sustain your life, right? Is that what you,
Yep.
okay.
Yeah. So think about like $10 million net after taxes, after everything is 500,000 a year in
Yeah.
income. And so if that's my number, then I go look at 500 is my number, then I back into the 10, and then I go, okay, what's the typical upfront check versus an earnout check? Because we don't ever want to count on the earnout when we sell our company, especially when you sell to private equity, which are more notorious for really not
Stripping the
fully
asset, right?
fulfilling. Yeah, and
Yeah.
this without trying to get too specific versus like selling to a strategic where the earnout's much more guaranteed.
Mhm.
But there's a lot of things there. But look at your taxes, which is 20-25% likely if it's capital gains, at least in the United States it is. And then look at the earnout. So that helps you figure out, okay, my number must be 17 because after taxes and then after the earnouts,
After
I'm
earnout.
going to end with 10. And
Yeah.
so, I mean, that's just a fictitious kind of equation, but that's a real number for most people.
Yeah.
Um, and so,
And the
what
number
kind of
doesn't have to be
business do I need to
500. It
build?
could be like
Yeah,
for you, the number might not be 500. It might be for someone listening, it might be 50, it might be 100, but whatever the number is,
yeah,
do the reverse engineering around that so you end up with a target and then you know.
Yeah.
But what did that do to you? I mean, let's go backwards again to the board meeting where you were in tech for 20 years, you sold your company, but it was, it's a company that you loved. You loved waking up in the morning, you loved nurturing your team,
Yeah.
you loved what you did, you loved everything about it. And, you know, offline, I've heard you talk about it with so much pride. And one of your board members talked you into it or convinced you that it was the right time, and you did this formula that all worked out for you. Knowing that number also helps you reverse engineer the business around the right targets too, doesn't it?
Well, it could, if my goal was an exit. And so
Yeah.
while I had done the numbers in my head and had my numbers, I also wasn't optimizing the business so I could hit those numbers, to what we talked about earlier. And in
Mhm.
fact, I got really good advice very early on to always pay yourself first. And so I took money off the table every year to a point where I already hit my first number from just the excess profits that I was able to take off the table every year. And one year it's maybe 10,000, and another year it's 100,000. And then as you grow the business, that number starts to increase. But I would always keep 6 months of runway cash in the business. We never tapped our line of credit except for one time in 20 years. Um, and paying yourself first ended up being one of the best moves because one, I already built a certain amount of success financially based on that. But then secondly, when it did come to an exit, I didn't need the money anymore.
Right.
And I have a friend that sold, had a very similar business, but was more in debt and did not take money off the table. They sold for about half of what we sold for in a very similar business because I had the optionality to wait and to also just be a little more stern in the negotiations because I didn't need it.
Right. I think that's really so this idea of profit first, the idea of paying yourself first is really challenging for a lot of people, especially small. And
Mm.
the idea really is that look, if you've got this much revenue, rather than revenue minus expenses equals profit, it's revenue minus profit equals this is what you got to run your business with. And that changes the
Yeah.
mindset, doesn't it?
Well, I think it does, and most, but the trap that most people fall into, and it's elusive and sexy, but they take all the profits and they put it into next year, and then reinvest it back in the business. Um, and I would do that too after I took my cut out, and
Right.
so and I always paid myself first, and even if it was a little bit, like I said earlier, it's just the habit and the discipline of doing that. And what happens, 9 out of 10 times, unfortunately, when most people just plow everything back into the business, they don't get the outcomes that they were hoping for. The ROI is not there, and they end up in a similar position that they would have ended up had they just paid themselves first already.
It's almost like paying yourself first is summiting your current mountain. The current mountain,
Yeah,
right? It's almost like that you're adopting that philosophy within the business also, isn't
yeah,
it?
I love that. Yeah, if you think of each year as a small hike up this, you know,
This
six
foothill or
thousand foot
whatever.
mountain or
Yeah,
whatever. Yeah, absolutely. I love that idea of, and let's celebrate success each year. and
right.
and and let's take it off and then let's see what we're left over with. I would absolutely reinvest profits every year, 100%. I wouldn't pocket everything and then start from zero. But and those investments paid off sometimes and sometimes they didn't. But it was never. It really set me up where I didn't had a lot of optionality and I didn't have to do things that I didn't want to do, which is where I'm at now too, but in a different way.
So that discipline, let's talk about the discipline of taking a little bit off, leaving a little bit in, growing, like what that ratio was. Do you remember the ratios in the early days? Do the ratios change over time? What did that look like?
Yeah, there was no ratio. I say discipline, and now I'm going to come up with an approach that doesn't sound very disciplined, but it was, maybe one year we wanted to buy a new house. And so I pulled the down payment out.
Mhm.
of the business and said, we're going to use this in 6 months for the down payment. Um, it's much harder, especially when you're not as profitable, to have that discipline, because the allure to kind of reinvest that back feels like a lot more of a pull. One thing that we always focused on was, in our business with software consulting, for context, was trying to hit 20% profit, like net profit. And that's a very healthy target. Most businesses and services, if you're at the top of the top, like Capgemini's, you're probably at 8 to 10%. 12% is considered healthy, 15 is considered outstanding. We always shot for 20. We hit somewhere between 15 and 20 most years. Um, and so I think maybe what you're targeting also drives what's available at the end, so that you can have that discipline to pull some out.
So your target really influences your outcome, is what you said there, right? Like having
Yeah.
a 20% target. I mean, if you had a 10% target, you wouldn't have hit 20. That's for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, I have an old band director, a jazz band director, and this was in the context of like marching band or something, but he said it's better to shoot for perfection and miss than shoot for imperfection and hit it. And that's always stuck with me. And that can get too extreme. Like, if you're a $10 million company and you say, I want to hit $100 million this year, it's probably not realistic. So what's a stretch, but what's realistic as far as a goal? And how do you
Mhm.
set that in your sights?
Yeah, that's amazing. So so when you think about those little mini victories, those annual victories, and then turning it into this other thing, now think about a post exit. All that structure of that you had, right, around summiting those little mountains every single year has changed. How have you brought that sense of discipline into what you're doing now?
Well, I don't know if I have. I'm just starting that sense of discipline. I've really considered the last almost 3 years to be opening the aperture and just exploring without any expectations about where it might go. And I've gone down a lot of rabbit holes that then I've come up and realized that that's not where I'm interested in. And so just giving myself permission to play and explore has been the priority. Um, I still continue to grow. I still continue to be in programs and with coaching and other things, but it's much more on a spiritual journey for me than it is on a business side. But that is all culminating into something where, in the last month, I have started to apply a lot more discipline with some daily practices that are important to me, that can drive me forward towards that goal.
And one of the things I think is really interesting, and I really, I full disclosure to everybody listening, Dustin and I have met in some of these coaching circles, the training that we've gone through, and actually happened to be in the same classroom together. And so I've seen that side of you. But one of the things that I think you have an innate comfort with is the sense that there is value to everything that people do. And I think it comes from this abundance mindset, but this discipline and rigor that you have around there is a value, and that value should be captured. Um, as you've gone through that spiritual journey, have you observed that in these other areas that are not tech? So tech is very, this is the deliverable, this is the thing, this is the project, this is the
Yeah.
the other explorations you've been doing are, well, maybe a little more nebulous. Is it interesting that to see other sectors and how they don't have that same understanding of value that
Yeah.
the business past has?
Yeah. I think just to clarify, like there's a lot of like I'm in a very important circle to me around conscious community, which involves like plant medicines and sound healings and a bunch of other healing modalities, body work. And I found in that group that typically there's more of a like sharing and barter economy than a traditional maybe capitalist economy. And as I move into that circle and with the offerings that feel important and aligned to me, one thing that is very top of mind is to not fall into that mindset, and that I want to, and maybe it gives me, frankly, an unfair advantage if I bring like this entrepreneurial mindset. And I'm going to use the word without apologizing like a capitalist mindset to charging what I'm the value that I'm bringing
Yeah.
and to not barter and to not discount it and to not excuse it because there's other people that charge less. Like what
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
bringing is valuable and important, and how this is manifesting for me right now is probably through a coaching practice, but I'm still exploring that, and I plan to charge a lot for it.
Mhm.
Um, and I think it will be worth it. And I'm going to bring a lot of different modalities into that to make it valuable. And there's a lot of other opportunities where there are coaches in a similar space that have similar modalities where they're going to charge a lot less. And
Mhm.
I'm not going to discount what I'm doing to fit into that model. I don't know if that kind of hits on what you're going
Yeah,
for, but
no,
that's what seems to me.
and I think it really all comes from this, to me, I'm just I'm I'm inspired by this abundance mindset that you brought to a company that was making $18,000 when you started, and you maintained that mindset all the way through. And this idea that you not only built a company that you want to work at, but also set out and spun out other companies that are similar to yours that, you know, other people would say directly competed with yours. But
Yeah.
you saw that as complementary. And then you're bringing that same sort of idea to what you're doing now in a field or in a sphere where that may be just as foreign as it was back then. And I think that's interesting, right?
Yeah. I love how you said that. And it is my every intention that I'm not going to go down this path alone. I plan to bring whoever wants to join me on the journey together because we're all going to have offerings we want to bring to the table. And they'll get paid well for what they're bringing. And so,
Right.
yeah, this isn't, it may have sounded a little harsh of like, I'm taking this capitalist mindset into this other circle where that's not really a very common approach. But I plan to, my goal is to help all boats rise with that approach and with this community that we want to build.
So do you find it at times how do you handle the conflict when you have this integrative mindset, right? In a very distributive world, right? The distributive world is that people think that there's a winner and a loser of every deal,
Mm.
and you don't approach things that way. You know, like I don't think that in hearing your story, you don't approach anything that way. You look at everything as an integrative environment. Everything is abundance. Everybody can win. There's a system where that happens. How do you approach people who are really distributive, who are really winners and losers? You're threatening me, and what? How do you bring them over to your side, or do you?
That's a really good question, and I've done it a couple of different ways. I've approached this problem in a couple of different ways, I should say. I used to, the most frustrating thing to me is that when two people are playing by different sets of rules, and if I'm coming from this abundance and win-win-win mindset, like that feels aligned to me. But when I'm confronted in situations where the other person is playing by different rules, my former approach would have been to continue to, this feels like a value judgment, but take the high road. And I would lose. I would lose. And that served me well overall. If you look at the scoreboard, like I'm winning still, even though I lost on those. What I've started to do in the last 5 years, and I feel aligned to this, as long as I'm not having to compromise my values, if someone wants to play by a different set of rules, then I'll meet them on the field where they want to play. And honestly, that's a new leap for me recently in the last 5 years or so, but it served me well. And I found when I meet someone where they are coming from, not withstanding my values and keeping that intact, it honestly, I think, is a healthy boundary that I've learned how to put up. And I think that's also served me well. And those situations have typically ended with a better outcome for me than it would have had I done it the other way.
Had
So
you
it's
just
on.
taken the high road and quote unquote high road and said, "Oh, they're going to play that way. I'm going to play this way, and whatever happens, happens." You're you you didn't always like the outcome to you in that situation because maybe you weren't protecting your boundaries. But this way, when you recognize the situation as it is, you're better able to just be yourself and almost de-risk it so that you get a
Yeah,
guaranteed better outcome.
honestly, yeah, I think it's a element of a good leader that understands how to stay authentic with yourself, but how to show up in a room in a way that everyone can relate to. And
Mm.
so I want to be very careful that like a chameleon comes to mind, but that could be interpreted as someone that is kind of shifting who they are to fit in. And I'm not saying that. I'm saying be authentic to you, but show up in a way that makes you more relatable. And so we think of it in a different context. And in these business contexts, if someone wants to show up in a way that that feels um, like a zero sum game, then I've learned how to play that game while keeping my core intact and my values intact.
What do you do to prepare for that that's different than, an integrated conversation, a win-win environment? How do you prepare for that differently? Because there is, and I agree with you. I think there's a flexibility of behavior, not a
Yeah,
flexibility of persona, not a flexibility of character, but a flexibility of behavior that permits you to play on that field, is the way you said it. So I agree with you. But what do you do to prepare yourself for those
yeah.
differences?
I love the word flexibility behavior. Like that's a great way to describe it. And I think that's a learned skill that gives you more in your toolbox to work with when you need it. To prepare for that, I'm thinking of two specific examples that I'm not going to go into the details of, but to prepare, I double check the intentions of the other party or parties, and I share my clear intentions of here's how I'd like this to go. Um, Here's what I'm perceiving from your side. And I loop around that 3 or 4 times to try to bring us all to a level of win-win-win. Um, when you meet or when I've met people that have been inflexible or just dogmatic about kind of their approach and where they want to go with it, then that's where I pivot. And so the prep really starts with can we please get aligned on this? Because it's going to be easier for everyone if we do. And if we can talk about what our desired outcomes are and not the egos in the room of how we got here or like I the more you can put on the table for what makes us happy on each side, the better chance you have of reaching an agreement that's mutually a win-win-win. But when you're dogmatic and you're focused on one thing, call it the value of your company versus the payment terms, the earnout, just there's 100 things you can put in a negotiation for a business exit besides the price of the business. But if you're
Mm,
only focused on the price, you're much less likely to come up with an agreement.
yeah.
So how do we put more on the table?
I love the transparency that come with to that. Is there anything that you need to do to reset after you play on a field that's not where you want to be, generally speaking? Or is that an easy reset for you?
I love the idea of a practice, maybe a cord cutting practice or just a cleansing comes to mind. I haven't done that. I am dealing with a situation now that feels very similar to this, where I think I'm going to have to play on a different field that I don't like to play on. And I love the idea. The way I plan to go into those conversations is I'll probably meditate beforehand. I'll do some sound work because I do a lot of work with. I'm a percussionist, so I work with a lot of different sound equipment and bowls and things like that, just so I can be centered and come from a place of the most resources possible. And so that I have the flexibility of behavior, to go back to your phrase, to show up in the way that has the highest integrity for me, but also shows up in the way I need to show up.
That's awesome. Dustin, we've been ending every episode this season with an expression of gratitude, and it comes from John Rulin, who was a early guest on the podcast. He grew to some international notoriety around a book that he wrote called Giftology. He's got a new book out now as well,
Mhm.
and he suddenly passed away. And in honor of his memory, we are paying forward his message with asking every guest to show some appreciation. So his paper napkin was what you appreciate appreciates, and we're asking our guests to show some appreciation in the world. Is there someone that you'd like to shout out, somebody that you'd like to appreciate to close the episode?
Yeah, what comes to mind as you were saying that is anyone that's trusted me to be a part of their journey feels really poignant to me right now. So anyone that I've worked with, any clients. So that's a broad bucket, but that feels really alive for me right now. If I have to get more specific, I think my board, that was a personal advisory board that also really focused on the business because that was a big part of my life. Like that was a turning point in my life and in my career to have a group that held up the mirror for me. So just want to show immense gratitude to that group for being there for me and for sharing selflessly. That feels like a very pivotal time in my life, and feel a lot of gratitude towards them as well.
Wonderful. Thanks for joining me, Justin.
Yeah, good to see you, brother.